She was 16 years old when the people of Cotton Creek decided that an old dress was all she would ever deserve. Her father had died beneath a runaway horse only 6 weeks before, leaving behind nothing but a weather-beaten cabin, 3 exhausted cattle, and debts that seemed to grow every morning like weeds after rain. The ranch foreman dismissed her with a quiet shake of his head, telling her that a girl could not possibly manage a cowboy's work. The merchants extended no more credit. Neighbors lowered their voices whenever she walked past. By the time the county's harvest fair arrived, Abigail Hart owned little more than the faded blue calico dress her mother had sewn years earlier, a pair of cracked leather boots, and enough coins to buy a loaf of bread if she skipped supper. The laughter began before she even reached the fairgrounds. Children pointed, women whispered behind gloved hands. Men looked away with the uncomfortable kindness reserved for those everyone expects to fail. None of them noticed the elegant carriage arriving at the opposite end of the square. None of them noticed the silver-haired woman who watched the scene in complete silence. And none of them could have imagined that hidden beneath years of pride, grief, and carefully guarded secrets rested a promise capable of changing not only Abigail's life, but the future of every struggling ranch family in Cotton Creek. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Abigail Hart. If you've ever felt judged before someone knew your story, tell us where you're listening from in the comments. The Wyoming Territory had a way of teaching difficult lessons long before children understood their meaning. Wide valleys appeared endless until winter arrived and revealed how quickly distance could become loneliness. Summer grass shimmered like gold beneath endless skies, yet a single week without rain could reduce hope to dust. Families who remained on the frontier learned to celebrate small victories because large ones seldom arrived without exacting a painful price. Abigail had been born during one of those hopeful springs. Her earliest memories were not of toys or parties, but of following her father through dew-covered pastures while the sun climbed over distant ridges. Thomas Hart rarely spoke without purpose. He believed children learned more by watching than by listening. If a fence post leaned, he straightened it before breakfast. If a calf wandered, he returned it before finishing his coffee. If someone in town needed help repairing a roof after a storm, Thomas appeared before they asked. "People remember how you stand beside them," he often said, "long after they forget what you gave." Those words settled quietly inside Abigail. Her mother, Eleanor, possessed gentleness that never weakened into softness. Every evening she mended, clothed by lamplight, humming songs learned from her own mother back in Missouri. Nothing in their home was wasted. Flour sacks became curtains. Broken wagon boards became shelves. Old dresses became quilts. When Abigail complained once that another girl's ribbons were prettier than hers, Eleanor smiled while threading another needle. "A beautiful heart," she whispered, "will always outlast beautiful fabric." Years later, Abigail would remember that sentence more clearly than any sermon she had ever heard. The Hart Ranch was never wealthy. It consisted of one modest cabin, a weathered red barn, 30 acres of grazing land, and enough cattle to survive modest winters if fortune remained kind. Yet laughter often echoed across the property. Travelers occasionally stopped for water and left with a warm meal. Cowboys shared stories beside the fire, while Eleanor prepared stew that somehow stretched farther than anyone believed possible. Abigail loved those evenings. She would sit quietly near the fireplace, pretending to read while secretly listening to tales of cattle drives, mountain storms, and distant territories waiting beyond the horizon. Every story planted another dream inside her, not of riches, not of grand houses, only of building something that would make her parents proud. As she grew older, Thomas taught her everything he knew despite raised eyebrows from neighboring ranchers. She learned to saddle horses before many boys her age. She could repair broken fencing with hands already rough from honest work. She memorized livestock records, calculated feed costs, and recognized approaching weather, simply by studying the movement of clouds above the mountains. Some men laughed. Thomas ignored them. "My daughter isn't preparing to impress anyone," he would answer. "She's preparing for whatever life decides to bring." None of them imagined how soon that preparation would matter. The first hardship arrived quietly. One unusually dry summer reduced grazing land across the valley. The streams narrowed, hay prices doubled. Ranchers sold cattle simply to purchase feed for those that remained. Thomas borrowed money against next year's herd, believing better seasons always followed difficult ones. For a while, they did. Then Eleanor became ill. At first, it seemed no worse than exhaustion. She tired easily. Her smile faded earlier each evening. Tasks that once required an hour consumed entire afternoons. By autumn, she rarely left her rocking chair near the front window. Doctors traveled slowly across the territory. Medicine even slower. One snowy morning, she called Abigail beside her. "You've been watching me worry?" Eleanor said softly. Abigail tried to deny it. Her mother only smiled. "No, child. You have your father's honesty written all over your face." She reached for Abigail's hand. "Promise me something." "I promise. No matter how poor you become, never believe poverty makes you smaller than anyone else." Abigail nodded through tears. Eleanor brushed a loose strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "And never let people decide your worth by the clothes you wear." She passed away before spring flowers returned. The cabin never sounded the same afterward. Thomas buried himself in work. Abigail buried herself in helping him. Neither spoke much about grief because neither wished to increase the other's burden. Sometimes healing disguises itself as silence. Sometimes silence simply waits for strength to return. Years passed. Father and daughter rebuilt what little happiness remained through routine. Morning chores, breakfast together, long days beneath open skies, quiet evenings, reading borrowed books beside the fire. They never became prosperous, but they remained content. Until the accident. It happened on a gray October afternoon. A frightened Mustang broke loose during branding. Thomas moved to protect another ranch hand standing directly in its path. The horse struck him with terrifying force before disappearing into the hills. Abigail reached him first. He was conscious, barely. Blood stained his shirt. His breathing came slowly. He looked toward the mountains glowing beneath the setting sun and managed a tired smile. "I guess," he whispered, "life finally found the better cowboy." "Don't talk like that. You'll have to." She gripped his hand. "I can't do this alone." He squeezed her fingers with surprising strength. "You already have." Those became his final words. Everything changed afterward, not dramatically, quietly, which somehow hurt even more. The bank representative arrived before the funeral flowers wilted. Creditors appeared, carrying polite expressions that failed to disguise impatience. Neighbors promised help while carefully mentioning families of their own. The ranch foreman explained there was no position available for a young woman. One merchant refused further credit. Another suggested marriage as though it were employment. Abigail listened without anger, only disbelief. She had spent years proving herself beside grown men. Now, every accomplishment vanished because her father no longer stood beside her. Winter approached. 3 cattle were sold below market value, then 2 horses, finally the wagon. Each sale removed another memory. Each empty space around the ranch felt louder than the last. By December, only the cabin remained, along with one old blue dress carefully mended dozens of times by Eleanor years before. Abigail continued wearing it because buying another was impossible. Eventually, invitations stopped arriving. Church conversations ended when she approached. Even kindness became awkward. People often fear misfortune because they secretly worry it might become contagious. When the harvest fair was announced the following spring, nearly everyone expected Abigail to stay home. Instead, she washed her old, dressed carefully in the creek, pressed every wrinkle she could, braided her hair exactly as her mother once had, and walked into town, carrying every ounce of dignity she still possessed. She had no idea that before the day ended, the cruel laughter surrounding her would begin the chain of events that changed Cotton Creek forever. The harvest fair opened beneath a bright April sky that made every painted wagon, polished saddle, and whitewashed stall appear cleaner than it truly was. Cotton Creek had spent 2 weeks preparing for the occasion because towns that struggled through hard winters often treated spring celebrations as proof that hardship had not won. Bunting hung between storefronts. A fiddler tuned beneath the hotel awning. Ranch families arrived carrying pies, quilts, carved toys, breeding records, and the kind of optimism people display publicly even when private accounts remain uncertain. Abigail entered from the eastern road shortly before noon. Her old blue calico dress had faded almost gray at the shoulders. Eleanor's careful stitching remained visible along the cuffs, where the fabric had worn thin and been strengthened more than once. The hem was slightly uneven because Abigail had repaired it herself by lamplight. Her boots were clean, but cracked. Her hair was braided simply without ribbons. She had done everything possible to appear respectable. The town saw only that the dress was old. A group of girls near the flower exhibit noticed her first. They were daughters of merchants and prosperous ranchers, dressed in bright spring colors with lace collars and polished shoes that had not crossed a muddy field that morning. One whispered something. Another laughed. The tallest of them, Lydia Crane, looked Abigail up and down with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never been required to defend her own place in a room. "Didn't your mother wear that dress?" she asked. Abigail stopped. "She made it." Lydia smiled toward her companions. "That wasn't what I asked." The laughter came again, soft enough to pretend innocence and loud enough to reach everyone nearby. Abigail felt heat move into her face. For a moment, she considered turning back toward the road. The ranch waited empty, and there was no dignity in allowing strangers to wound her for entertainment. Then she remembered Eleanor's hand brushing the hair from her forehead. "Never let people decide your worth by the clothes you wear." Abigail lifted her chin. "My mother made things to last," she said. "Not everyone understands the value of that." Lydia's smile tightened. Before she could answer, a woman's voice spoke from behind them. "Then perhaps everyone should learn." The girls turned. An elegant carriage stood near the fair entrance, black lacquered and drawn by two matching chestnut horses. Beside it waited a driver in a dark coat. The woman who had spoken appeared to be in her late 50s, with silver hair arranged beneath a restrained black hat, and a face that would have seemed severe, if not for the intelligence and quiet sorrow within her eyes. Her traveling dress was dark green wool, beautifully cut, but without unnecessary ornament. A narrow gold watch chain crossed her bodice. She carried no parasol despite the sun. People nearby began whispering for an entirely different reason. The woman was Beatrice Caldwell. Even Abigail knew the name. Beatrice had inherited the Caldwell Livestock and Rail Company after her husband's death and expanded it into one of the most powerful businesses across 3 territories. Her cattle traveled east in dedicated rail cars. Her horses were purchased by the Army. Her investments included feed depots, freight warehouses, grain elevators, and land most small ranchers could not cross in a day. Some described her as generous. Others called her cold. Everyone called her wealthy. Beatrice stepped closer to Abigail and studied the dress, not with ridicule, but with the attentive expression of someone examining fine work. "Your mother stitched this?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "By hand?" "Yes." Beatrice touched the reinforced cuff lightly. Small back stitches, nearly invisible. She understood fabric. She understood most things. Something moved through Beatrice's expression at the answer. What was her name? Eleanor Hart. The woman's hand became still. Around them, the sounds of the fair seemed to recede. Fiddle music continued. Horses shifted beside wagons. Somewhere, a child cried after dropping a sugared biscuit. Yet the space between Beatrice and Abigail felt sealed away from all of it. "Eleanor Hart," Beatrice repeated. "Yes." "Daughter of Nathaniel and Ruth Mercer from Missouri?" Abigail stared at her. She rarely spoke of her parents. "But those were their names?" "I believe so." Beatrice looked toward the mountains for a long moment. Then she asked, "And your father?" "Thomas Hart." "Where are they now?" Abigail did not answer immediately. The silver-haired woman understood before words arrived. "I am sorry," she said. There was nothing formal in the sentence, no polished sympathy offered, because manners required it. The sorrow sounded personal. "Did you know my mother?" Abigail asked. Beatrice looked again at the repaired sleeve. "Once." Before she could explain, the fair marshal approached with Mayor Crane, Lydia's father. The mayor wore a cream-colored vest stretched tightly across his middle and carried public friendliness as though it were another piece of clothing. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, nearly breathless, "Cotton Creek is deeply honored by your visit. We had no notice you would be attending." "That was intentional." "Of course, naturally. We have prepared a place for distinguished guests near the judging pavilion." "I am standing where I wish to stand." Mayor Crane glanced at Abigail and seemed irritated to find her occupying the attention he intended for himself. "Miss Hart was just leaving," he said. "No," Beatrice replied. she was not. The mayor's smile faltered. Beatrice turned to Abigail. "Have you entered anything in the fair?" "No, ma'am." "Why not?" "I have nothing worth entering." Beatrice's gaze sharpened. "That is rarely true." Abigail looked across the square toward the livestock pens, where young steers were being judged by weight and conformation. Beyond them stood the horsemanship ring. She had intended only to watch. Thomas had once entered cattle there, and the fair had been among the happiest days of her childhood. "I can ride," she said. Mayor Crane gave a short laugh. "The riding exhibition is for registered entrants with proper equipment." "I have no horse now," Abigail said. Beatrice looked toward a chestnut mare tied behind her carriage. The animal was tall, alert, and beautifully built, with a dark mane and one white mark at the forehead. "That mare is called Temperance," Beatrice said. "She dislikes nervous riders, harsh hands, and men who speak too confidently before mounting." The driver lowered his eyes to hide a smile. Beatrice continued, "Would you ride her?" Abigail looked at the mare. She saw the animal's weight resting unevenly on the rear right leg. Not injury, caution. The left ear tracked every movement behind her, while the right remained fixed on Abigail. The mare was not frightened, but she had learned to measure strangers. "May I approach her first?" "You may." The crowd widened. Abigail walked slowly, keeping her body angled rather than direct. She did not reach for the reins immediately. She let the mare smell her hand, then touched the neck below the mane. Temperance's skin twitched. Abigail spoke softly, using the low, even tone Thomas had used with unsettled horses. The mare lowered her head. Abigail ran one hand down the shoulder, checked the girth, then crouched near the right rear hoof. A small stone had lodged beside the frog. "She is favoring this." "Foot!" Abigail said. The driver stepped forward. Abigail removed the stone carefully. Temperance shifted her weight, tested the hoof, and stood evenly. Beatrice watched without speaking. "You may ride," she said. The exhibition began 20 minutes later. Abigail borrowed a plain work saddle from a ranch hand who remembered Thomas kindly. Her dress was not designed for public riding, but she arranged it modestly and mounted without assistance. Several men along the rail exchanged amused looks. Lydia Crane stood near her father, arms folded. The first riders guided their horses through barrels and low jumps, displaying speed rather than partnership. Applause followed every dramatic turn. When Abigail entered the ring, she did not force Temperance forward. She waited. The mare listened. Together they moved through the course with such quiet precision that the fair gradually fell silent. Abigail did not lean roughly into turns or pull against the bit. Her hands remained low. Her seat followed the animal's movement. At the final jump, Temperance hesitated for half a breath. Abigail felt it. She did not strike. She gave the mare room to decide. Temperance cleared the rail cleanly. The applause began near the livestock pens and moved around the ring like weather crossing open ground. Abigail brought the mare to a controlled stop before Beatrice. For the first time that day, Beatrice Caldwell smiled. It changed her face completely. Thomas Hart had been right. Abigail had not been trained to impress anyone. She had been prepared for whatever life decided to bring. Life, that afternoon, had brought a wealthy woman with a long memory. The judges awarded Abigail second place, though nearly everyone understood she had ridden best. Mayor Crane's nephew received the blue ribbon. Abigail accepted the red ribbon without complaint. Beatrice noticed that too. After the exhibition, she invited Abigail to sit beneath a cottonwood beyond the noise of the square. Teresa Crane's bakery wagon provided coffee and bread, though Beatrice paid for both before anyone could call the food charity. For several moments, the older woman said nothing. She looked at Abigail as though searching for the remains of someone else within her face. "Your mother saved my life," she said at last. Abigail lowered the bread. "How?" "Not in the way stories usually mean. There was no river, no fire, no dramatic rescue. She saved it by seeing what I had become before I was brave enough to admit it." Beatrice's gaze moved toward the fairground. "We were 17 when we met at a girls' academy in St. Louis. My family had money. Eleanor's did not, though they had enough to send her for 1 year because a teacher recognized her ability. I was proud, frightened, and cruel in the careless way privileged girls can become cruel when they believe humiliation is entertainment." Abigail thought of Lydia. Beatrice noticed. "Yes," she said, "very much like what happened today." "What did my mother do?" "She defended another girl whose dress had been mocked." Abigail looked down at the blue calico spread across her knees. Beatrice continued. "The girl's father had failed in business. Her clothing was repaired and unfashionable. Several of us laughed. Eleanor looked at me and said, 'A person who needs another's poverty to feel elevated is standing lower than she knows.'" Abigail almost smiled. "That sounds like her." "It does. I hated her for saying it. Then I respected her. Eventually, I loved her as the finest friend I had ever known." "Why did she never tell me?" "Because we separated badly." Beatrice's voice became quieter. Her father arranged an advantageous marriage. Eleanor learned Beatrice intended to accept, despite knowing the man's company had displaced tenant families through dishonest contracts. Eleanor begged her to refuse or demand changes. Beatrice accused her of jealousy and self-righteousness. They exchanged bitter words. Beatrice married. Eleanor left the academy. "She wrote to me twice," Beatrice said. "I answered neither letter. Years later, when I understood she had been right, I searched for her. Her family had moved. The trail ended. And now? Now I have found her daughter wearing a dress made by her hands." Grief entered the silence between them, but it was not Abigail's alone. Beatrice reached into her traveling case and removed 2 yellowed envelopes tied with a narrow blue ribbon. "Her letters," she said. "I have carried them for 32 years." Abigail did not take them immediately. "You kept them, but never answered?" "Yes." "Why?" "At first, pride. Later, shame. Eventually, I believed too much time had passed to ask forgiveness without making the request another burden placed upon her." Abigail looked at the woman's careful clothing, expensive carriage, and hands resting uneasily around old paper. Wealth had protected Beatrice from many discomforts. Not this one. What did she write? She described the life she hoped to build. A ranch where hired hands were paid fairly, a school close enough for ranch children to attend during winter, a lending fund for families who lost cattle to drought. She believed communities should protect people before they were desperate enough to surrender everything. That sounded like Thomas, too. The dream had belonged to both of Abigail's parents, though poverty had never allowed them to build it beyond their own kitchen table. Beatrice placed the letters in Abigail's hands. "They belong with you." Abigail untied the ribbon. The first letter had been written before Eleanor met Thomas. The second came years later, after Abigail's birth. Her mother described the Wyoming Valley, the small ranch, and a daughter who followed her father everywhere and came home with mud on her dress and questions no adult could answer quickly. At the end, Eleanor had written, "I still believe people can change, Beatrice, though I no longer believe they change merely because they are loved. Sometimes life must take away the comfort that permits them to remain as they are." Abigail read the line twice. Beatrice was watching the ground. "Did life take away your comfort?" Abigail asked. The older woman gave a faint, sorrowful smile. "Eventually. Her husband died after years of increasingly reckless business. Beatrice inherited not only wealth, but records showing how much of it had been built through unfair leases and crushed competitors. She spent the next decade restructuring the company, forgiving some debts, improving wages, and returning land where claims had been obtained fraudulently. It was not enough to repair every harm, but it was more than regret. "I came to Cotton Creek because my company is considering a rail spur through this valley," she said. "The town council has offered land and exclusive shipping rights. Mayor Crane had spoken publicly of the proposed railway as Cotton Creek's salvation. Merchants imagined new customers. Ranchers imagined better cattle prices. No one had mentioned that the Caldwell Company would control the loading yards and freight rates." Beatrice continued, "I intended to sign the preliminary agreement today. After seeing what happened in the square, and after learning Eleanor's daughter has been left without help while the town congratulates itself on progress, I find I have questions about who this agreement would truly serve." Abigail folded the letters carefully. "Are you going to cancel the railroad?" "No. That would punish families who need it. But I will not hand its benefits to a small group of men who already possess more influence than judgment." "What will you do?" "I have not decided." "Then why tell me?" "Because your mother changed the direction of my life with one honest sentence. I suspect you may possess the same inconvenient gift." Abigail considered the valley, the ranch, debts, the winter feed shortages, and the way small cattle owners were forced to sell low because they could not afford to transport animals elsewhere. "A railroad will not save them if they must pay one man to reach it," she said. Beatrice nodded. "What would?" "A public loading yard. Rates posted where everyone can see them. A feed warehouse owned by the ranchers together. Smaller families allowed to combine shipments. And no contract that takes a ranch when one winter goes badly." Beatrice's eyes sharpened with interest. "You have considered this?" "My father did." "What else?" "A school near the southern range. Children miss half the winter term because the road into town becomes impassable." "What else?" A veterinary station. We lost cattle because the nearest doctor was 2 days away. Beatrice did not write any of it down. She remembered. Before they returned to the square, she asked about the Hart Ranch. Abigail explained the debt, the forced sales, and the bank's intention to auction the cabin and remaining land within 10 days. How much is owed? Abigail's shoulders stiffened. I am not asking so that I can pay it, Beatrice said. Not yet. The answer was $186, including penalties Abigail believed had been added unfairly. Beatrice asked who held the note. Mayor Crane's brother owned the bank. That explained the mayor's interest in directing the rail agreement. By late afternoon, Beatrice requested every document concerning the proposed spur, loading yard lease, and land transfer. Mayor Crane welcomed her into the council office, believing signature and celebration would follow. Instead, she spent 3 hours reading. Abigail waited outside with Teresa Lang and several ranch families who had begun gathering after hearing the wealthy visitor had taken an interest in her. When Beatrice emerged, Mayor Crane's face had lost its color. "The current agreement will not be signed," she announced. A murmur spread through the crowd. The mayor stepped beside her. "Mrs. Caldwell merely requires minor revisions." "No," Beatrice said. "I require a new agreement." She explained that the loading yard would be held by a cooperative, open to every rancher in the county. Shipping rates would be public and equal by weight, not personal influence. 20% of the company's local freight profit would support a drought reserve, a veterinary station, and a rural school. The land the town had offered freely would instead be leased at a fair annual rate paid into the community fund. Mayor Crane objected that such arrangements were impractical. Beatrice looked toward Abigail. "Only to those who profit from the present arrangement." Then she announced one final condition. The Hart Ranch would become the first temporary headquarters of the cooperative, provided its accounts could support recovery rather than foreclosure. Abigail stared at her. The crowd turned. Mayor Crane spoke quickly. "That property is already scheduled for auction." "Then postpone it." "The bank holds the note, and the Caldwell Company holds deposits nearly 10 times the size of that bank's capital." The mayor became silent. Beatrice did not purchase Abigail's ranch as a gift. She did something more careful. She ordered an independent review of the debt. By sunset, her accountant had discovered unlawful penalties, duplicated winter feed charges, and a payment Thomas had made that the bank had never credited. The true amount owed was $94. Beatrice offered the Hart Ranch a cooperative development contract. The ranch would host livestock inspections, shared equipment, and the future school until permanent buildings could be constructed. Abigail would receive wages as its caretaker and record keeper. Those wages would pay the corrected debt over 3 years. "You will keep the land by working," Beatrice told her privately, "not by owing gratitude to me." Abigail's eyes filled despite her efforts. "Why are you doing this?" "For your mother, partly." "That is not enough." "No," Beatrice agreed. "It is not." She looked across the fairground where the old dress had first drawn laughter. "I am doing it because Eleanor spent her life believing I could become better than the person who hurt her. I would like to prove that her faith was not entirely wasted." The laughter from earlier had disappeared. Lydia Crane stood beside the flower stall, watching Abigail with an expression that seemed caught between embarrassment and resentment. Her father remained near the council office, already calculating how much influence the new agreement would cost him. But the town's reaction no longer mattered in the same way. Abigail had entered Cotton Creek believing she possessed one old dress and a nearly lost ranch. She left the fair carrying her mother's letters, a red riding ribbon, a signed employment agreement, and the first clear path toward the dream her parents had never lived long enough to complete. The wealthy woman had changed her immediate fate. What no one yet understood was that Abigail would not accept a future that saved only herself. The Hart Ranch had once fed travelers, sheltered injured hands, and extended help before anyone needed to beg. If it survived, it would return to that purpose. And before the railroad tracks reached Cotton Creek, Abigail would discover that Mayor Crane and the bank had taken far more from the valley's struggling families than anyone had dared examine. Beatrice's arrival had opened one door. Behind it waited a deeper reckoning. The first rail surveyors arrived in Cotton Creek 3 weeks later, carrying brass instruments, rolled maps, red marking flags, and the cautious authority of men accustomed to being welcomed wherever their measurements promised profit. They began at the northern ridge, followed the valley floor toward town, and placed the proposed loading yard on a stretch of land beside the creek that Mayor Crane had already described as unused. Abigail knew the land was not unused. For nearly 30 years, small ranch families had driven cattle through that corridor to reach the public watering bend. The path did not appear on formal maps because it had never needed to. Everyone knew where it ran. Everyone used it. Children learned it before they learned the county road. If the rail yard enclosed that ground, ranchers south of town would be forced to cross Cranebank property and pay whatever access fee the mayor's brother chose to impose. Abigail found the problem while reviewing the survey map at the Hart Ranch kitchen table. Beatrice had given her copies of every proposed agreement and instructed the engineers to answer her questions as they would answer a company director. Some resented taking direction from a 16-year-old in an old blue dress. Others had watched her handle temperance at the fair and decided patience was wiser than pride. Abigail traced the marked rail line with one finger. This fence closes the creek path. The senior engineer, Mr. Tolland, leaned over the map. The land is listed as vacant. It is used for seasonal cattle passage. Use is not ownership. No, Abigail replied, but closing it could ruin families who cannot afford another route. Mayor Crane, who had attended the meeting uninvited, cleared his throat. The southern ranchers can negotiate access through the bank parcel. Abigail looked at him. At what price? That would be determined later. By your brother? The room became quiet. Beatrice sat near the window, listening. Mayor Crane smiled with visible effort. Miss Hart, business cannot be planned around every informal habit of poor ranchers. Abigail thought of her father straightening fences before breakfast and her mother turning flour sacks into curtains because every useful thing deserved consideration. A path used for 30 years is not a habit, she said. It is how people survive. Beatrice closed the map. The yard will be moved east. Mr. Tolland began to object that the alternative ground required additional grading. The company will pay for it, Beatrice said. Mayor Crane's face hardened. This is becoming unnecessarily expensive. For whom? Abigail asked. It was the first of many questions he disliked. The cooperative began modestly. The Hart barn became its office. Thomas's old work table held membership forms, freight estimates, feed purchase agreements, and the first draft of rules written in language every rancher could understand. Abigail insisted no document exceed 2 pages without a plain explanation attached. Families came hesitantly at first. Some feared the project would disappear once Beatrice left. Some distrusted anything connected to a railway. Others believed Mayor Crane would punish anyone who joined. Abigail did not persuade them with promises. She showed numbers. A family shipping 10 cattle alone paid 1 rate. 5 families combining 50 cattle paid far less per animal. A shared hay order reduced winter costs. A veterinary station prevented 1 sick herd from becoming 5. Thomas had taught her that trust began slowly, so she began early. Beatrice remained in Cotton Creek longer than planned. She rented rooms at the hotel but spent most days at the Hart Ranch, reviewing company reports beneath the porch, while Abigail worked cattle, repaired fencing, and met with families. The wealthy woman did not try to replace Eleanor. She understood that grief resists substitution. Instead, she became useful. She arranged for an honest livestock doctor named Dr. Amos Reed to visit twice each month. She purchased lumber for a temporary classroom, but listed it as an advance against future cooperative earnings. She hired 2 widowed ranchwomen to oversee the feed warehouse. Every decision was designed to create work rather than dependence. Still, whispers followed Abigail. Some said Beatrice had chosen her out of guilt. Some said the girl had performed poverty at the fair to attract sympathy. Lydia Crane repeated that Abigail's new importance came from one wealthy woman's charity, not merit. Abigail heard these stories and continued working. Then the bank review widened. The duplicate charges on the Hart note were not isolated. Beatrice's accountant, Mr. Silas Penford, compared bank statements with feed store invoices and discovered a repeating pattern. During drought years, Crane Bank had added emergency handling fees to loans, then listed the same sums again as unpaid interest. Ranchers who made partial payments received no proper credit. Foreclosed land was sold through a company whose ownership led back to Mayor Crane and his brother Horace. The transactions were technically concealed, but not well enough. Greed often mistakes exhaustion for ignorance. Abigail and Mr. Penford spent evenings sorting records in the Hart kitchen. They compared handwriting, dates, cattle sale receipts, and land transfers. Beatrice could have assigned attorneys to the task and removed Abigail entirely. She did not. "This concerns your neighbors," she said. "You should understand every line." One account belonged to widow Sarah Boone, who had lost 80 acres after her husband's death. Another belonged to the Navarro family, whose payment receipts showed they had nearly cleared their loan before the bank declared default. Another belonged to the ranch hand who had died trying to stop the runaway horse that killed Thomas. Abigail looked at the records until the numbers blurred. How long has this been happening? Perhaps 9 years, Mr. Penford said. Then everyone knew something was wrong. Many knew their own account felt wrong. Few knew the pattern. That was how unfair systems survived. Each person believed the harm belonged to them alone. Abigail carried copies to the affected families. Some were angry, some ashamed. One elderly rancher placed his receipts on the table and said, "I thought I had failed my sons." "You did not," Abigail answered. The words felt larger than the room. Mayor Crane learned of the review when 3 families demanded their original loan records. He appeared at the Hart Ranch the following morning in a polished buggy, accompanied by Horace and the county attorney. Abigail stood beside the barn doors. She wore the same blue dress, though Teresa had helped strengthen the hem again. Mayor Crane looked at it with open disdain. "You have exceeded your role. My role is keeping cooperative records. Bank matters do not concern the cooperative. They concern every rancher whose land you expect the railway to serve." Horace stepped forward. "You possess stolen financial documents. We possess copies provided by account holders. Those records are confidential." Confidential from the people paying them? The county attorney shifted uneasily. Beatrice came down the porch steps. Mayor Crane addressed her instead. "Mrs. Caldwell, surely you understand the damage this girl is causing." Beatrice looked toward Abigail. "I believe she is measuring damage that already existed. You came here to build a railroad, not undermine our institutions." "I came to conduct business. Your institution appears to have confused business with concealment." Mayor Crane's composure cracked. "You would risk an entire rail project over the complaints of debtors?" "No," Beatrice said. "I would risk it over dishonest books." Then she announced that Caldwell Livestock and Rail would place no funds with Crane Bank, sign no land agreements involving the Crane family, and begin construction only after an independent territorial audit. The mayor's face turned pale. "You cannot dictate county affairs. I can decide where my company invests." The audit began within 10 days. At first, people were afraid to testify. Bank debt had shaped their lives for years. Mayor Crane still controlled council appointments, warehouse permits, and several grazing leases. Abigail visited families one by one. She did not tell them courage would be easy. She told them silence had already been expensive. Sarah Boone spoke first. Then the Navarros. Then 12 others. The evidence became impossible to dismiss. Crane Bank had collected unlawful penalties, withheld payment credits, manipulated appraisals, and transferred foreclosed land to private companies below market value. Mayor Crane had used council authority to approve roads and water improvements that increased the value of those parcels after his family acquired them. The territorial examiner ordered the bank's lending records seized. Horace Crane resigned. Mayor Crane refused. He called a public council meeting, believing the town would defend him against outside interference. The meeting filled the courthouse. Ranchers stood along the walls. Merchants crowded near the doors. Lydia sat beside her mother, no longer laughing. Mayor Crane spoke for nearly half an hour. He described himself as a builder of Cotton Creek. He reminded the town of roads, fairs, church donations, and jobs. He said difficult decisions had been necessary. He called the accusations misunderstandings encouraged by outsiders and an inexperienced girl. Then Abigail was asked to speak. She carried no prepared speech, only Eleanor's old letters and a stack of account copies. She stood where everyone could see the faded dress. They laughed at this dress, she began, because it was old. The room became still. My mother made it. She repaired it when the sleeves wore thin. I repaired it after. She died. People saw patches and decided they understood what I was worth. She placed the bank records on the table. These accounts were treated the same way. Families lost land, and people decided they must have been careless. Widows fell behind, and people called them poor managers. Ranchers sold cattle, and people said they could not survive modern business. She looked toward Mayor Crane, but when we followed the numbers, we found something else. They were not all failing. Many were being charged twice, denied credit for payments, and pushed from land someone else wanted. The mayor rose. This is sentiment, not proof. Abigail lifted the first receipt, then the second, then the bank ledger copy. No, she said. The sentiment came first. The proof came after. Mr. Penford presented the full findings. The territorial examiner confirmed them. The county attorney, who had arrived intending to protect the council, announced that formal charges and civil claims would follow. Mayor Crane was removed from office that evening. There was no dramatic arrest before cheering crowds. Quiet justice moved more slowly and with greater precision. The bank entered supervision. Improper foreclosures were reviewed. Land still held by Crane companies was returned when possible. Families who could not recover their original property received compensation from seized assets. The Hart Ranch debt was cleared entirely because Thomas's uncredited payments had exceeded the corrected balance. Abigail received the news at the kitchen table. For several seconds, she did not understand. "You mean I owe nothing?" Mr. Penford smiled. "You mean the bank owed your father an apology it can no longer give him." Abigail walked outside. The late sun lay across the pasture. Thomas's barn cast a long shadow. Eleanor's rose bush, neglected through winter, had produced one small flower near the porch. Abigail sat on the steps and cried, not because a wealthy woman had saved her, because her parents had not failed. That truth returned something money could not. The rail spur reached Cotton Creek the following autumn. Its loading yard stood east of the public creek path. Freight rates were painted in large figures where no one could alter them privately. The cooperative feed warehouse opened before winter, allowing families to purchase hay together at lower cost. The Southern School began in 2 rooms added to the Hart barn. Children arrived by wagon, horseback, and on foot. The veterinary station opened beside it under Dr. Reed's direction. Abigail managed the cooperative books and continued ranch work each morning. She refused to become merely an office clerk because Thomas had taught her that figures made more sense when the person recording cattle had also mended fence around them. Beatrice transferred ownership of Temperance to the cooperative then to Abigail personally. She should belong where good riders can learn, she said. Abigail understood. The mare became the first horse used in a training program for ranch children who owned no animal of their own. Lydia Crane appeared one morning with her younger brother. Their family had lost wealth and social position after the bank's collapse. The girl wore a plain brown dress. Abigail did not mention the harvest fair. Lydia stood near the barn, unable to meet her eyes. "My brother wants to learn to ride. He can join the Saturday group. We cannot pay. There is no fee." Lydia finally looked up. "Why are you helping us?" Abigail thought of Eleanor, who had once defended a poor girl while Beatrice laughed. She thought of the way humiliation traveled through generations unless someone decided not to pass it onward. "Because he did not do what your father did," she said, "and neither did you." Lydia's eyes filled. "I laughed at you. Yes, I am sorry." Abigail nodded. She did not rush to comfort her. Forgiveness did not require pretending harm had never happened, but she opened the barn door. That was enough for a beginning. Beatrice remained connected to Cotton Creek for the rest of her life. She visited twice each year, reviewed the cooperative without controlling it, and wrote Abigail letters between visits. Their relationship never became simple. Beatrice's kindness could not restore Eleanor or erase 32 years of silence. Yet it became honest. On the 5th anniversary of the railroad, Beatrice asked Abigail to walk with her beyond the Hart pasture. They stopped beneath the cottonwood, where Thomas once repaired tack. "I spent many years believing change was something I could purchase," Beatrice said. Abigail smiled faintly. "And now? Now I believe it is something one must practice where no one is applauding." She handed Abigail a small box. Inside lay Eleanor's blue ribbon from the academy, preserved between folded paper. "I think this belongs here." Abigail tied it around the letters her mother had written. She kept them in the cooperative office beside Thomas's ranch ledger, not hidden, not displayed as decoration, available to anyone who wished to understand why the place existed. Years later, visitors arriving by rail saw the Hart Cooperative spread across the valley. They saw shared corrals, busy loading platforms, a schoolhouse painted white, and grazing land still crossed by the public path Mayor Crane once intended to close. They saw families who had nearly lost everything shipping cattle together under rates they could read and challenge. They often saw Abigail, too. She became a woman with strong hands, steady judgment, and the same calm way of looking at a room before speaking. She could have replaced the old dress many times over. Eventually, the fabric became too fragile to wear. She did not throw it away. She folded it carefully and placed it in a cedar chest. Later, sections of blue calico were sewn into a quilt for the school reading room, surrounded by pieces donated by ranch families, work shirts, baby blankets, aprons, saddlecloth, and dresses worn through difficult years. No piece matched, together they made something warm. At 16, Abigail Hart had walked into the harvest fair wearing the only dress she owned. People laughed because they saw age, poverty, and repair. They believed new fabric indicated greater worth. A wealthy woman changed Abigail's fate that day, but not by handing her a fortune or carrying her away from hardship. Beatrice Caldwell listened, remembered, opened records, and placed influence behind fairness instead of ownership. Then Abigail carried the change farther. She used the opportunity to protect the creek path, expose dishonest loans, restore family land, build a cooperative, open a school, and give children access to horses, knowledge, and work their parents had been denied. The old dress did not become beautiful because a wealthy woman admired it. It had always been beautiful. It held Eleanor's stitches, Abigail's repairs, Thomas's dust, funeral tears, fairground laughter, and the dignity of a girl who refused to become smaller because others had mistaken poverty for failure. That was what Cotton Creek finally learned. Worth is not created. When powerful people recognize it, recognition merely reveals what was already there. Thank you for staying with us through the story of Abigail Hart, Eleanor's old blue dress, and the second future built at Cotton Creek. Share this story with someone who has ever been judged by what they lacked rather than by what they carried inside. And tell us in the comments, when has something old, worn, or overlooked held more meaning than anything money could replace? Your reflections help these stories reach farther than the final fence line. Until next time, stay close.